Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the French philosopher and writer Albert Camus and his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. But before I get into the details here, let me first say something about the individual Sisyphus and his backstory, because it's pretty important and revealing in the sense that it reveals a lot about Camus himself. Okay, so Sisyphus is a mythological figure written about in Homer's Iliad and in other works of Greek mythology. And the basic story about him goes like this. So Sisyphus was somebody who loved life so much that he never wanted to die. So what he did is he descended into the underworld, where he managed to trick Hades, the god of death, and shackle him under the sun. Now, with Hades locked up like this, of course he couldn't perform his work, which is to say, no one could die anymore, including, of course, Sisyphus himself. But eventually, Hades gets rescued by Ares, and when that happens, Hades gets back to work and mortals resume their mortality. But stubborn Sisyphus doesn't give up. No, what he does is he tricks Hades a second time. So what he does is, prior to his own death, he instructs his wife to neglect his funeral libations when he's gone. Then, when he's dead and in the underworld, he complains to Persephone, the captive wife of Hades, that he didn't receive his proper due. So he persuades her to grant him a brief reprieve so that he might return to life and see that the proper libations are poured, the proper respect paid. Now, what do you think happens? Well, it's pretty obvious. Of course, as soon as he sees the light of the day, Sisyphus is gone, and he does not return, and thus again turns his back on death and the gods. Okay, so that's Sisyphus's backstory. The stuff that happens before the more well-known part of his eventual fate, which is the part, of course, that Camus focuses on, and what I'll get to in a second. But the reason that I wanted to mention it in some detail, this backstory that is because I think Sisyphus's basic attitude really does reveal a spirit that runs deep in Camus himself. I mean, Sisyphus's scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life and for light. Well, these themes, like living passionately and resistance to death and the love of life and the denial of the gods, these are themes that really personally resonated with Camus and will go on to figure centrally in his general outlook on things. Anyway, so now let's talk about what happens to Sisyphus. And this is the part of the Sisyphus story that Camus describes at the end of his book and uses to help convey his larger philosophical message. So what happens in the myth is that the gods eventually have their way in the end, as they always do, of course. So what happens is that Sisyphus eventually gets tracked down and he gets punished for his grand contempt of the gods. And for all the trouble he gave them, they wanted to make sure to give him the worst punishment possible. So what happened to him was this. He was taken to a mountain in the midst of what we must imagine to be a dry and a barren and a lifeless landscape. Here he was condemned to ceaselessly roll a boulder to the top of a mountain only to have it endlessly roll back down again. There would be no respite from this, no escape. He was to perform this same task forever, for eternity. Now, of course, what makes it the worst form of punishment possible is that it's marked by ultimate futility. The boulder never rests at the top. There is no temple to build. There is no hope of success. Okay, so when we read Camus and his retelling of Sisyphus's situation here, it's hard not to see but pessimism and even a kind of desolation in all of this. After all, like I mentioned, we read that the poor man is condemned to the most dreadful punishment conceivable by the gods, an infinite life of futile and hopeless labor. That is, he's assigned the task of rolling an enormous rock up a mountain only to have it fall back down again, whereupon the task must begin anew. And not only this, but Sisyphus is also solitary. He's weather-beaten. He's straining himself with that shoulder, suffering strong pains. And finally, because he realizes that he's fated to do this forever, Sisyphus appears to be always scornful and disdainful, constantly confronting his condemnation with revolt, perpetually fighting against his absurd situation. So again, on a first reading, the impression that we get of Sisyphus and his life seems to be a pretty bleak one. Okay, but here's the thing. We shouldn't be too quick to assume this. What's really important to notice is that even though it seems bleak on the surface, Camus speaks twice of Sisyphus's joy. He makes several references to happiness, and he mentions no less than 3 times that all is well with the condemned man. Now, this shouldn't surprise us, and that's because it's Camus' project in the myth of Sisyphus, and in fact it was his project right from the very start of his thinking as a very young man, to try to understand how it is that we can be happy, given what he calls the absurdity of the human condition. Okay, but now, the absurdity of the human condition. What's that? Well, okay, for those of you who don't know, what Camus does is he takes Sisyphus's absurd situation to represent our own. We are all like Sisyphus. We're all like Sisyphus in the sense that our lives and our projects are marked by ultimate futility, which is to say they're destroyed by our death. In other words, what death does for Camus is it cancels out everything that we've done and renders them in the long term meaningless. So that's part of what he means by absurdity. But in a broader sense, when Camus talks about absurdity, he also means something like our confrontation with a world or a larger cosmos that refuses to give us meaning. In other words, the absurd occurs when our need for ultimate meaning shatters against the indifference and larger meaninglessness of the world. Our death, of course, being one aspect of this. And by the way, if it isn't already obvious, for Camus, the absurd also reveals the absence or the loss of a transcendent purpose and value-giving God. In other words, Camus' position is an atheistic one. Now, and this is the important point, what Camus is interested in is how it is that we can imagine Sisyphus ever being happy given the absurd situation that he finds himself in. One, again, marked by ultimate futility and hopelessness. And of course, what Camus is really trying to figure out by doing this is how it is that we can ever achieve a genuine happiness, given that Sisyphus's plight is our own. In other words, how can human beings be said to be happy in a world marked by death and the absence of any ultimate meaning? That's the question. Or is it possible for us to navigate our way through the absurdity of life without, on the one hand, succumbing to despair, or on the other hand, falling into the disingenuous comforts of metaphysical hope? Like I said earlier, well before the writing of Sisyphus, Camus' central motif was how to find happiness and meaning in a world in which meaning is not given. He criticizes religious believers for their life-denying attitudes and practices. There is no afterlife. Our kingdom is of this world, he says in one of his earliest works. He urges us to accept life's lack of transcendent purpose and its contradictions without self-deception or false hope. At one point, he tells us that there is not superhuman happiness. There is no eternity outside of the curve of the days. I can see no point in the happiness of the angels. In other words, there is nothing but this world, this life, the immediacy of the present moment. Now, given such a picture of things, then, the question becomes, how is it exactly that we are to understand happiness? Well, given that our situations are similar, maybe if we can imagine how it is that Sisyphus could ever be happy, then that might help us to understand how we could be, right? Well, okay, so let's look closely at Sisyphus then. So one thing that Sisyphus does is he eventually comes to accept the reality of his situation. He doesn't try to escape into another make-believe world, but he confronts his reality head on. Now, this commitment to truth and to lucidity, despite its initial discomfort, this, I think, serves as the foundation of Sisyphus's happiness and joy. Well, okay, so since for Camus, Sisyphus's plight is our own, then we too must begin with seeing our situation lucidly if we want to be happy. You see, what Camus values the most is intellectual integrity. For him to look straight at the truth, which just is to look straight at the absurd and to live in its implications and manifestations rather than to evade or dismiss it, that becomes the foundational condition of happiness for him. Now, of course, as Camus says, seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. But at the same time, for him, to live in falsehoods and illusions is not to live a genuinely happy life. You know, I'm reminded here of a letter by Nietzsche, whom Camus was deeply influenced by. And it was a letter to his Christian sister. It goes like this. It goes, "If you wish to strive for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe. But if you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire." Actually, you know, this also reminds me a little bit of the science fiction film, The Matrix. As most people know, in that movie, the protagonist, Neo, is faced with a choice between taking a red pill, which will awaken him to the actual world, one full of war and destruction, or a blue pill, which will return him to the comfortable, simulated reality that he's been living in all along, the Matrix. And of course, Neo chooses the red pill because despite the costs, he yearns for the truth and he realizes that life in the Matrix would be an inauthentic and an unreal one. He wants the happiness or the satisfaction of an authentic life, even with its many ups and downs and its harsh truths and tragedies. And he doesn't want a disingenuous happiness, one completely severed from ourselves and from reality. Well, this is not too far from Camus. For him too, happiness is best attained by keeping a firm connection to reality, despite its discomfort and ultimate absurdity. For Camus, there is no real joy of life without despair of life. As he says, happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. Okay, well, so how else are we going to imagine Sisyphus happy? Well, I think Camus wants us to understand that another crucial component to Sisyphus's happiness or joy is his passion. I mean, what Sisyphus seems to do is he seems to use the consciousness of the futility of his situation as fuel for the building of a fire inside of him that now burns hotter than it ever did before his fate was decreed. Now, this is manifested in his scorn towards the gods and in his general revival or re-enchantment of the world around him. Having accepted the limits of his situation, but not reconciled himself to them, Sisyphus now turns to his life with a higher intensity and a new set of eyes. Well, in a somewhat similar way, Camus thinks that if we accept that life ends in death, that it has a time limit, that there is no transcendence, and what's more, that there are no absolutes or ultimate values in life, then we can turn back to our lives with greater passion and energy and intensity of involvement. Now, why is this? Well, because the recognition and the acceptance of our limits or boundaries intensifies and heightens everything around us. Kind of like confronting the knife edge or precipice of a mountain suddenly takes the whole moment and experience to a higher pitch. Having accepted the absurd, we now become more available to the concrete present and to the richness of the world. We become more attuned to sensations and to colors. Free from abstractions, ideas, and aims, we are thrown into the very heart of life, the very flame of life. Okay, well, so how else can Sisyphus help us out here? In what other way can he be said to be happy? Well, here's what I think Camus says. He says that Sisyphus is free, that he has a freedom he never had before. Now, here's the thing. On the face of it, to say of Sisyphus that he's in any way free doesn't seem quite right, does it? After all, Sisyphus is a prisoner of the gods. He's fated to roll the dreaded rock forever. So, how can we talk about a freedom here? Well, I think Camus thinks it's in this way. He thinks it's in Sisyphus's recognition and acceptance of his situation and in his removal of all hope and illusion in which a new freedom grows. As one commentator put it, this is a kind of freedom in the present devoid of future expectations. Or we might say, along with Camus, that it's a latitudinal freedom rather than a longitudinal one. In other words, without looking up to a future to be distracted by and counted on, all of Sisyphus's attention gets harnessed to the present, which now becomes, for the first time, fully available. This newly recognized freedom, Camus thinks, is essential to Sisyphus's joy. Okay, but how does Sisyphus relate to us here exactly? Well, Camus thinks it works something like this. So before our recognition of the absurd, we always thought of the future, right? That's to say, we set goals established beforehand by our society, we adopted roles, we took up a profession. In other words, we acted as if everything had a pre-established meaning or a justification, or as if this was the way it was supposed to be, or as if there existed certain principles that we were supposed to live by. But this is just the illusion of freedom, says Camus. Now, why is that? Well, because, as I suggested, all of our actions were in bondage to society and to its various prejudices and to all sorts of future expectations. But the discovery of the absurd upsets all of this. It brings with it the realization that the goals that we have set and the plans that we have made and the future that we have betted on is ultimately without any larger sense. For, as Camus says, there is no hope since death is there as the only reality. But again, as strange as this sounds, this is not necessarily a bad thing, and we shouldn't be broken by it. And this is because what opens up to us now, Camus thinks, is a much more genuine and profound freedom, one that's free of all illusions. We now recognize that our previous freedom was actually a kind of pantomime and a kind of slavery. That is, as one commentator put it, our former identification with our role, our conformity to a particular way of life, our susceptibility to moral and social influences, our subjection to daily routines, they all serve to hamper or restrict us. We realize now that we had created for ourselves barriers between which we had confined our life. Ultimately, the absurd, Camus says, liberates us from all such constraints and so increases our availability to the present moment, to the life right in front of us. So, at the end of the day, and somewhat paradoxically perhaps, for Camus, it's only when we come to recognize our mortality and our limitations that we are able to realize our true freedom. And with it, a kind of happiness. Bye for now.